Welcome to a discussion about reinventing the monuments, men and women for the 21st century force, hosted by the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative. My name is Brian Daniels, and I am the Director of Research and Programs for the Penn Cultural Heritage Center at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and a Research Associate at the Smithsonian Institution. It is an honor to have been asked to moderate today's conversation, which marks the beginning of the new Army Monuments Officer Training Program. For those of you listening who are not in the armed forces and unaccustomed to military acronyms like me, some of the organizational jargon can be daunting. But I found that this is also very important when considering who exactly has the responsibility to safeguard civilians and cultural heritage in times of war. Over the next hour, you are going to hear a great deal about the United States Army Civil Affairs and Psychological Operations Command Airborne, known better and affectionately as USACAPOC. USACAPOC has a critical role in the restoration of civil society following an armed conflict. It is composed mainly of United States Army Reserve soldiers who have regular civilian careers as urban planners, lawyers, engineers, teachers, and even the odd archaeologist and art historian. As reservists, they deploy as they are needed to address specific tasks and problems. USACAPOC's 38 Gulf Career Program is a small subset of civil affairs personnel divided into 18 specialized skill sets known as skill identifiers. Those with a background in cultural heritage preservation have the 6 Victor skill identifier. Together, USACAPOC and the Smithsonian created the Army Monuments Officer Training Program to develop a new cohort of 38 Gulf 6 Victor Heritage and Preservation Officers. The animating idea behind it has been to increase the number of experts in uniform supporting the implementation of the 1954 Hague Convention for the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict, the principal international law intended to prevent the destruction of cultural heritage in war. The collaboration between USACAPOC and the Smithsonian, I believe, is what Congress intended by establishing the Interagency Cultural Heritage Coordinating Committee at the Department of State in the Protect and Preserve International Cultural Property Act of 2016, and by creating the position of the Cultural Heritage Protection Coordinator at the Department of Defense in the National Defense Authorization Act of 2018. Today's reinvented heritage and preservation officers inherit a storied legacy. In the wartime protection of cultural heritage, the role of the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program during World War II looms large. Their names are among the luminaries of mid-20th century artists, art historians, curators, and conservators. Some are buried in Italy, laid to rest inside the monuments they helped to stabilize and to restore. Their efforts have been chronicled by Lynn Nicholas in Rape of Europa and Ilaria Bray in The Venus Fixers, and brought to movie theaters by Robert Edsel. And thanks to the efforts of the Monuments Men Foundation for the Preservation of Art, the Monuments Men and Women collectively received the Congressional Gold Medal in 2015. Historians like Kathy Pice continue to examine the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program to see how their efforts transform the cultural life of American academic institutions and national security. This World War II effort still informs us about the treatment of cultural heritage in times of war and in times of peace. We now look to the Army Monuments Officer Training Program and the heritage and preservation officers who come through it to be the next generation of monuments, fine arts, and archives officers. The revitalization of the training program and of this cohort has long been the goal of heritage advocacy organizations such as the United States Committee of the Blue Shield, who seek to ensure the fidelity of this country to its international responsibilities to people and to their culture. Raphael Lemkin, the great 20th century jurist who coined the legal term genocide, wrote that armed conflict resulted in 3 irreplaceable losses: human life, treasures of art, and historical archives. While many are concerned with minimizing civilian harm, We look specifically to the heritage and preservation officers to do their part in mitigating damage to treasures of art and to historical archives. This need is especially great as present-day conflicts now see conflict actors deliberately target cultural heritage as a combat strategy more and more, in direct violation of international norms and law. Many organizations have been involved in making today's discussion possible, as well as the training itself happen. I want to acknowledge and to thank USACAPOC, the Smithsonian Archives of American Art, and the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative for their participation and efforts. The Andrew W. Mellon Foundation has been instrumental in its support, as has the Bank of America, the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative's lead corporate sponsor. For this special occasion, the Bank of America has prepared a pre-recorded video from the audience.
Hi, I'm Larry DeRita, the president for Bank of America for the greater Washington, D.C. area. I'm also the head of strategy and public policy here in Washington. It's a great honor to be able to welcome you to the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative. We're very pleased to partner with the Smithsonian in this work. We have several partnerships with the Smithsonian. That includes founding membership on the board of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. We also have our own program of art restoration, which is very similar to the work that you're doing, although a little less dangerous perhaps. We've funded the restoration of more than 170 masterpieces around the world in more than 30 countries, including a couple of copies of the Magna Carta and the Winged Victory at the Louvre in Paris. Finally, we have a wonderful legacy and history with the Department of Defense and with the United States military. And for more than 100 years, we've offered specialized products and services to the United States military. We operate all the military bank branches at military installations overseas around the world. And we also have more than 10,000 military veterans and military spouses. And I'm a military veteran myself as a former naval officer serving in our company. So the program of support to the Smithsonian, arts preservation, and our affinity to the military kind of comes together in the Cultural Rescue Initiative. And we're very pleased to be able to work with Corey Wegner and her team to kind of bring it to you. What you're doing is very important. I had the great pleasure to work with civil affairs and psychological operations officers for several years when I was leading the public affairs department at the Pentagon. And I've seen the great work that teams, civil affairs and PSYOPs teams do all around the world in parts of the world that are very dangerous. And you're really truly bringing freedom and communications and opportunity all around the world. And you'll be doing that in this program as well. I spent a couple of months in Baghdad in April and May of 2003 and had the chance to visit the Iraq Museum, saw the true devastation there. Corey Wegner was there at around the same time, and all those great professionals trying to preserve antiquity, trying to preserve history. As Dr. Curran, one of your panelists today, has said, preserving cultural heritage is really preserving knowledge and identity, and that's your mission, and you should be very proud to be embarking on that mission. We're certainly proud to be able to support you in doing it. I wish you the very best for your training over the next 6 weeks. And hopefully if the phase 2 training is done live in the spring, I'll have the opportunity to meet with you and thank you personally for what you're doing. I wish you the very best, and we're very pleased at Bank of America to be able to. Thank you very much.
We will begin by exploring some of the historical context surrounding the predecessor Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program during World War II. There is a rich legacy here, as well as an important tradition to uphold and make better and stronger. We will then be joined by leaders from USACAPOC and the Smithsonian to talk about how the Army Monuments Officer Training and the 6 Victor Heritage and Preservation Officer positions took shape. We will look at what the stakes are for cultural heritage and why the United States Army and the Smithsonian are working together. We will then hear from the new Heritage and Preservation Officers themselves about their motivations and what inspires their participation. Finally, at the very end of the discussion, there will be opportunities for audience participation. Please type your questions into the question box as I will be collecting them throughout our conversation. With a topic as difficult as the preservation of cultural heritage during conflict, we need to understand something of how it was done in the past. We are going to begin with George Stout, a leader in the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program during World War II. He is acclaimed as the father of modern conservation science, and his legacy continues to shape the field of heritage preservation because of the innovative methods that he pioneered decades ago. Thanks to New Mile Media Arts, director Kevin Kelly, and producer Marie Wilkes, we are able to offer a special preview about this extraordinary individual from the new documentary, Stout-Hearted, George Stout and the Guardians of Art.
George Stout became the country's leading conservator of art. He brought newfangled scientific methodology to conserving paintings.
The greatest theft in history, it's hard to condense that to a soundbite. The Nazis had 6 years where they were in control of country after country after country.
If Hitler had gotten into the art school, things might have been very different in Europe and in the 1940s.
And that the United States didn't want to be in this war, but we were in it now.
Japan and America are at war. And I remember their faces absolutely turned white. They came rushing in.
The great risk was that we might end up winning the war, but in the process become the goats of history for destroying so much of Western civilization's culture. President Roosevelt in June 1943 had completely endorsed this idea of cultural preservation officers. But it was Stout's thinking, the years of planning, both as to the big picture of needing to do something, creating these cultural preservation officers that we call monuments men. And there were hundreds, if not thousands, of different places that this handful of men were responsible for checking out every single one of them to try and identify what's there.
It was just a miracle that more of them weren't killed because the Germans had hidden these collections and various other treasures in all kinds of mines and caves and things, but they were usually booby-trapped.
So the policy of the Western Allies was to return these things to the countries from which they'd been taken, and that they would be diligent in trying to get them back. If there's a father that gave birth to this concept of modern-day monuments men, it was George Stout.
The Smithsonian Archives of American Art holds important collections related to the World War II Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program, including material from George Stout himself. Liza Kerwin, Interim Director of the Archives of American Art, joins us now for a very special behind-the-scenes look. Liza, what do you have to share with us?
Thank you. Thanks, Brian. It's my great pleasure today to publicly reveal for the first time a very important recent acquisition at the Smithsonian. In June, the Archives of American Art acquired 4 World War II diaries kept by art conservator and monuments man Lieutenant Commander George Stout, pictured here. I want to thank Dr. Richard Curran for making this acquisition possible. The diaries date from June 15, 1944 to August 11, 1946. In the first 3, Stout chronicles his activities in Europe, and the 4th concerns his time in Japan. In these 4 volumes, Stout recorded with clarity and precision his movements through France, Germany, and Japan, at first surveying the damage to historic monuments, and then discovering and recovering looted treasures. Thousands of paintings, prints, sculptures, books, archives, tapestries, and more, stolen and stockpiled by the Nazis. The diaries tell an extraordinary story of heroism, persistence, problem solving, and cultural recovery. Next slide, please. On the 4th of July, 1944, Stout's transport was anchored at Utah Beach in Normandy. The details are fresh and jump off the page. This was less than a month after D-Day, and though US and Allied forces had pushed the German army to retreat, Stout noted that there was a submarine alert and light attack by enemy aircraft that first night. Pressing on into Normandy 3 weeks later, Stout and his team inspected an 11th century Romanesque abbey in the town of Lisieux, writing, quote, "Had to take roundabout road because of tank overturned on pontoon bridge near Lisieux. Walked in from edge of town, vehicle held outside. In the margin, he added, stepped over dead German." The striking thing is that the Germans had literally retreated days earlier, bombing the abbey as they left. Next slide, please. Stout includes a sketch of the plan of the Abbey of the Holy Trinity, noting area heavily mined and inspection limited. While some of the walls were still standing, much of the church was destroyed to the foundation. Next slide. The diaries include Stout's temporary duty orders granting entry into restricted areas under the command of General Omar Bradley. Next slide. On May 7th, 1945, with the surrender of all German forces, Stout wrote in passing, quote, "Heard that active hostilities this theater had substantially ended," end quote. He carried on, supervising the recovery of thousands of stolen artworks, underscoring in his diary, "Holdings packed and hoisted." It is amazing what Stout accomplished and the logistical problems he solved. Packing and transporting stolen works was an enormous task. His workforce consisted of displaced persons and Allied prisoners of war. They were weak. He needed rations. Trucks broke down. Roads were blocked. His duty orders were temporary. At 04:30 on April 15th, 1945, he wrote, "No time for sleep." Next slide, please. The most spectacular recovery was from the Alta Sea salt mine in the Austrian Alps. And here is a photograph of Stout outside that salt mine. According to his diary, he arrived there on May 21, 1945. He chronicled the contents based on Nazi records. 6,577 paintings, 2,300 drawings or watercolors, 954 prints, 137 pieces of sculpture, and more. These were destined for Hitler's art museum that was planned for his hometown of Linz in Austria. In the dark, damp depths of the mine was the Ghent altarpiece in 8 panels, Michelangelo's Madonna of Bruges, and paintings by Cézanne, Vermeer, and other masterworks. Next slide, please. And here's Stout in the center, hoisting the Madonna of Bruges up with ropes in the salt mine, packing it with blanket scraps and what appears to be curtains. Often working with unreliable lines of communication and limited resources, Stout used whatever packing materials he could find. Next slide. At the end of the 3rd diary, Stout returns to the States. In one of his last entries on August 14th, he notes the official announcement of the Japanese surrender. And shortly after, he is assigned to duty in Japan. According to his 4th diary, pictured here, Stout arrived in Tokyo on October 15th, 1945, just 2 months after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Here he reports on reparations concerning Chinese cultural treasures looted by invading Japanese forces during World War II, and his administrative work to develop policies and procedures for the protection of Japanese monuments. In all 4 diaries, Stout mentions fellow monuments men, and here refers to Langdon Warner and a reception they attended in Kyoto on May 29, 1946. Next slide, please. And here's a photograph of that gathering from the archives. Langdon Warner, who is 3rd from the left in the front row, with Stout on his right hand, was an American archaeologist and art historian specializing in East Asian art. He was a professor at Harvard and brought on as an advisor to the monuments men in Japan. He is reputed to be one of the models for Steven Spielberg's Indiana Jones. Next slide. Stout was also immortalized in film in the movie The Monuments Men, or at least the character of Frank Stokes, played by George Clooney, was modeled after Stout. Lieutenant Commander Stout was eventually awarded the Bronze Star and the Army Commendation Medal for his efforts. Next slide, please. The Archives of American Art holds a good concentration of the papers of the monuments men and oral history interviews of them, providing a depth of resources for anyone interested in this period. Next slide. At the archives, we're also honored to hold in trust for the nation the Congressional Gold Medal that was awarded to the monuments men in 2014. The Congressional Gold Medal is one of the highest civilian awards in the United States. Today, George Stout's legacy lives on in the work of the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield and today's Heritage and Preservation Officers. Next slide. The diaries will be conserved, digitized, transcribed, and returned to the context of George Stout's papers at the Archives of American Art. We're deeply grateful to Richard Curran and all who made this acquisition possible. And now ending the PowerPoint, I want to show you the diaries that are here with me. Here's the first and others. It's difficult to show them. You can see Stout was not only a World War II hero, but one of the founding fathers of art conservation. And these diaries are fragile and have suffered some water damage over the years. It's only fitting that we conserve them and preserve them for future generations. Here's the second one. Let's see. The third is quite fragile. Ooh, wait. These. I will rejoin you at the end of the program for question and answers. And until then, thank you for your attention.
Thank you for sharing these new collections, Liza. No doubt they will be valuable for researchers in the future, but also an important touchstone for so many of us concerned with heritage preservation and conservation. And I'm very glad you're going to be able to join us during the question and answer session. Now, seeing the diaries that Liza showed us is a reminder of how much the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program occupies our collective imagination about efforts to protect heritage in times of conflict. What does it take to re-envision the legend of the monuments men and women? How did leaders at the Smithsonian and the Army see this training as fitting into their organizations? What does it mean for the people involved? Joining us now, we have Brigadier General Jeffrey Coggin, Commander of the United States Army Civil Affairs and Psychological Operations Command Airborne, that is, USACAPOC. Dr. Richard Curran, Distinguished Scholar and Ambassador at Large at the Smithsonian Institution. Colonel Andrew Scott DeJesse, 38 Gulf Program Director of the USACAPOC Strategic Initiatives Group, and Corinne Wagner, Director of the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative and retired United States Army Civil Affairs Officer. I'm going to direct my first question to General Coggin. So General, no doubt we have with us in the audience a group that is highly aware of military doctrine and a group of heritage professionals that have less of an understanding of the United States Army. I would like you to tell us more about what your vision is for the Civil Affairs Specialists and the 38 Gulf 6 Victor Heritage and Preservation Officer Program. How does this program and the training in collaboration with the Smithsonian Institution advance your mission?
Hey, good morning, and thank you for this question. It is an honor to be with you today and to be a participant in this event to kick off the Army Monuments Officer Training. My vision for the 38G Civil Affairs Specialist Program, and in particular the 38G 6 Victor Heritage and Preservation Officer Program, is for it to become manned and trained at a level that meets our unit's requirements and empowers our abilities to conduct civil affairs operations and civil military operations. While AMOT is a new initiative, the Army has a history of proven success in training partnerships. It was 77 years ago when the Army, the Harvard Group, and the American Council of Learned Societies worked together to create the original Monuments Men of World War II. That success is still celebrated to this day. AMOT builds on the same spirit of partnership, and it represents as the command's first effort to build the 38G capabilities alongside civilian institutions. The AMOT program goes a long way to support the USACAPOC by providing a training opportunity and venue that is the best in the world. Through this collaboration with the Smithsonian Institute and the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, the AMOT participants will be instructed by world-renowned experts in the field. Through this experience, it will not only result in trained officers, it will also build relationships and a common understanding between these military officers and the civilian experts to facilitate cooperation and working relationships that can bring great dividends well into the future. We could all find ourselves working together in some distant land together in the future, but it could also be a non-permissive environment where our civil affairs specialists are on the site, and through our relationships from the training and collaboration, we have reached back to the experts at the Smithsonian. Although the AMOT is centered on cultural heritage, it's also a goal to enable a greater civil military operations capabilities to identify and understand civil considerations and population-centric operational variables of political, military, economic, social, information, and infrastructure sectors. The training will align civil expertise with military processes of problem analysis and developing courses of action that achieve mission objectives. Through enhanced capabilities and understanding, the operational environment, the civil affairs force, the Army, and organizations across DoD become the beneficiaries. We are grateful to the Smithsonian team for joining us in such an effort. Thank you.
Thank you, General. I'd like to turn now to the other major partner in the new Army Monuments Officer training, that is, of course, the Smithsonian Institution, and to Dr. Richard Curran. Dr. Curran, the Smithsonian Institution, as the largest museum and research complex of the world, is of course a global leader in heritage preservation, a fact reflected in the museums and the collections on the National Mall, but also in its research centers such as the Museum Conservation Institute and the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. Can you tell us more about how the Smithsonian came to be invested in seeing the Heritage and Preservation Officer program succeed?
Sure, Brian. And I too am very pleased to be here with everybody today, my colleagues. Look, the Smithsonian has a long history with regard to the protection of cultural heritage in conflict. Goes back to the Civil War. The Secretary of the Smithsonian was President Lincoln's science advisor. The U.S. Army even issued the Smithsonian 12 muskets and 240 rounds of ammunition to defend the castle on the Mall, worried that the Confederacy would invade Washington, and we were supposed to protect the national treasures. Fast forward to World War II, where the Smithsonian participated in the group that defined and helped the formation of the Monuments Men. And the Smithsonian advised mainly in the Pacific with regard to World War II operations and sensitivity to culture. But the Smithsonian has long believed that culture is not only preserved in museums and in cases, but in living people's lives, in society, on sites around the world, historic buildings, archaeological sites, and so on. I think the modern episode of this really is traceable to Haiti. This was a humanitarian crisis after the Haitian earthquake in 2010, but very important because we knew at the Smithsonian, having done many projects with Haiti, how important culture was to the resilience of its people and its survival in the face of that devastating earthquake that killed over 200,000 people. And so we figured we had to do something. We had the expertise to do something. We had relationships with the Haitians, but what to do? And I was inspired by Corey Wegner, quite frankly. We hadn't met before, but I knew about Corey's work in Iraq after the 2003 US invasion of Iraq and her attempts with others to preserve the Iraqi Museum, and how important that was in terms of showing respect to the people that we were there to help. And so Corey and I went down to Haiti after the earthquake. We met with General Keane, who was in charge of the US response. There were 15,000 servicemen and women working on that Haitian response. And the US had previously invaded Haiti. There was a lot of distrust in Haiti about US motives. And here we wanted to help out in the best of all intentions. And General Keane really got it. And he said, you know, Richard, if the Smithsonian and you all can help preserve Haitian culture, which was in the rubble, which is totally devastated, and totally disheartening. If you can help us engage the Haitians and show that we respect who these people are, what their culture is, and their history of struggle and resilience, that will help our troops and our efforts. And so the US military provided engineers and logistic support and others, and we ended up saving about 35,000 artifacts, artworks. We worked on sites, we trained many Haitians, and we found that we had a role in the world of cultural recovery and rescue. We were also familiar with other efforts in the military. Laurie Rush had served in Iraq and Afghanistan and giving troops playing cards so that we wouldn't inadvertently destroy things that the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or ISIS or other forces were doing. And we got involved in the Middle East, in Iraq, because our experts knew about sites in Iraq, and we worked with the DIA in terms of no target lists, along with Blue Shield and other experts. And we ended up working closely with the military and saying, okay, how can we not do what ISIS did? How can we show respect for the Iraqi people, the culture and civilization that ISIS has tried to erase in erasing the identity, the diversity, and the history of that country, and indeed part of our civilization. So we worked with our colleagues at the University of Penn. Brian, you were involved, Blue Shield was involved, and we ended up producing these booklets for the invasion of and the retaking of Mosul and Raqqa. And these basically document cultural resources in those cities, resources that ISIS had really damaged, tried to destroy. US Special Forces, the Iraqi army, Peshmerga, and allies went in. We would actually help save those resources as per the Hague Convention and as per our own doctrine. And I think that really propelled us in ongoing relationships and realizing, as you said at the beginning, Brian, culture has become a target. Culture is not only vulnerable in natural disasters because of global warming and other issues, but in conflict, it's become an actual target to dispirit and devastate populations. And we realize at the Smithsonian that history embodies who we are as human beings, as different cultures and societies. And so I think it was last year, General Cogan and I signed an agreement between the US Army and the Smithsonian to provide and help for the training of the next generation of monuments men and women. This is entirely consistent with the 2016 legislation to preserve and protect cultural property and our work together, not only between the Smithsonian and the US military, but with other agencies from Homeland Security and FBI, state, and so on. So we're very proud of this partnership, and we look forward to contributing to the work of the next generation of monuments men and women.
Thank you so much, Richard. And I think that you highlighted one of the key issues for me surrounding the 1954 Hague Convention, and that is that it's about showing respect. It's about showing respect for people and showing respect for their cultural heritage. I want to drill down a little bit more specifically on the training program itself. And so I'm going to turn to Colonel DeJesse. And, you know, with this question, I mean, Colonel, you have put an immense amount of time, effort, and energy to see the 38 Gulf 6 Victor Heritage and Preservation Program realized. What do you hope that these officers will provide the United States Army that is both similar and different from the Army's earlier historic efforts to protect cultural heritage?
Well, thank you, Brian. Appreciate it. So the similarities between the monuments men of World War II and the current heritage preservation officers is that they're highly skilled experts with the task of protecting and safeguarding cultural property in conflict environments and under combat conditions when the situation arises. The difference, I would say initially, is that the monuments men of World War II was more centered around defeating armies and capturing cities, and the monuments men of old was more object-centric. Today's conflicts are more about relate to asymmetric warfare and are human-centric. So that applies to the means and ways in which six victors will operate. So in terms of utilization of technologies, advisory roles, focusing on partnerships with local institutions of the areas that we're deployed with. They need to play a crucial piece of this, and so that they are the stewards of their own cultural property. The third is kind of how we're developing the capabilities, and it aligns with that kind of asymmetric warfare, multi-domain aspects. And I'm going to get a little doctrine with you right now, military doctrine, because we have to be able to speak cultural property protection to the Department of Defense and the partners. Relating to issues, there's bigger problems we're dealing with, and we're a small set of that, protecting cultural property. So you have issues with security and justice and reconciliation, humanitarian assistance and social well-being. General Coggin mentioned a few of these, governance and participation, economic stabilization and infrastructure. And relating to multi-domain operations, and I'm going to highlight a few here because we need to get very specific in this training about what we're doing and not speak in general terms. So in multi-domain operations and specific phases, the competition phase, civil reconnaissance, do we understand, are we ready, and where are we knowledgeable about heritage domains on places we might deploy to, and where we're doing training partnerships in peacetime. Civil engagements, what networks do we have, and how are we developing those networks? Analysis, civil analysis specifically, degrees of threat towards cultural property, who is doing it? Are they extremist groups? Are they transnational criminal organizations? Are the external actors that are affecting communities and societies that don't have the resources to protect their cultural property? The phase of penetration, speaking in those terms for cultural property protection, is understanding the environment. Do the countries that we're supporting and we're partnered with, do they have cultural property inventories, and doing analysis gaps on those and how it can best identify? Because when a conflict environment, it's the fog of war, everything's scattered. What can we do prior to that to kind of assist and be prepared and prepare the organizations we're supporting? Disintegration phase, talking about in terms about how cultural property, understanding it and leaning into protecting it, will analyze and evaluate the changing human geography and what's happening to that society, and also hybrid threats too. And then the idea of no strike lists, that we are prepared to advise the correct agencies on developing those, ensuring that we're protecting sites and not actually targeting, or actually, being aware of certain things and what areas are protected. And so our counterparts, combat arms, brothers and sisters, they're aware of what's going on. Exploitation, relating to civil reconnaissance and engagement, and then the phase of return to competition. And I just want to highlight the deal of the responsibility of military governance operations, and how civil protection of cultural property is a mechanism, and as Dr. Kieran said, to foster resilience and social cohesion. These are important. Such differences speak about a complex world in which we operate in, and how it requires us to have a transdisciplinary approach to protecting cultural property, and having the ability to exchange knowledge with the professionals across domains, and expand the capabilities, and also the beneficiaries that are beyond traditional beneficiary audiences we've had before. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colonel, for putting this in the doctrinal context about what this training is meant to achieve. And what I want to do is I want to turn now to Major Wegner to think about this issue a little bit more. Major, you served in Iraq in very difficult circumstances, working with your Iraqi colleagues to help restore the National Museum in Baghdad in 2003 and 2004. How do your experiences then help to guide you now as you and Colonel DeJesse have developed the Army Monuments Officer Training?
Thanks for the question, Brian. Well, I'll say even though Civil Affairs has retained its cultural property protection mission as part of its responsibilities since World War II, back in 2003, we had very few arts, monuments, and archives officers, as we called them back then. While helping colleagues at the Iraq National Museum was one of our most important tasks, our small arts, monuments, and archives team was responsible for the bigger tasks of linking to the Iraqi Ministry of Culture colleagues and the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage to determine their needs and help with stabilization and recovery at a number of institutions across Iraq. We also served on the theater level staff and provided expertise and advice to the Coalition Provisional Authority. We had a lot of tasks to cover and relied heavily on good working relationships with Iraqi colleagues, coalition allies, international organizations and NGOs, academic colleagues, and other US government agencies like the Department of State. At the end of a tough day, I would reference back to reading my battered copy of The Rape of Europa and about the trials and tribulations of the monuments officers and George Stout. Like, for example, on a day I couldn't get a security team to take me to the Iraq National Museum to work, I would read about George Stout and how he had to basically steal a car to get around and doing his duties during World War II. And it made me feel a little bit better. However, it was tough on the job training. We were very few to do a really hard mission, and I always wished that I could have done more and done better. Our goal for the AMOT training, though, is to help today's heritage and preservation officers build on their already strong specialized education and experience by adding training on the historic, legal, and social context of cultural heritage protection in armed conflict from top experts in the field. We'll have briefings from colleagues at several US agencies, from academia, and international NGOs working on cultural heritage issues. We're also really fortunate to have several international military officers as part of our course. Welcome to you, Lieutenant Colonel Tim Purbrick from the UK Military Cultural Protection Unit. And we'll have a lot to learn from each other about how our countries are doing support, implementation, and respect for the 1954 Hague Convention. Things will get real in phase 2 next year, which we hope we'll be able to safely do in person. Participants will visit a number of Smithsonian collections as well as institutions in Washington, D.C. Smithsonian experts will provide hands-on technical training in disaster preparedness and emergency response for cultural heritage, specially tailored to armed conflict scenarios. And unfortunately, the Smithsonian staff colleagues at the Museum Conservation Institute and SCRI and other units at the Smithsonian have a lot of experience in the past several years on learning more about methodologies for working with cultural property damaged in armed conflict. The 6 victors will face a realistic and challenging final exercise scenario to save a cultural heritage collection in a high stakes environment. So I just want to add that I'm really inspired by this group of dedicated young professionals and so optimistic about their capabilities. We think this training and other military training the 6 victors will receive will help them in a variety of possible contingencies in today's multi-domain environment. Thanks.
Thank you, Major Wegner. And I think I can safely say that it is the goal of everyone in this program that it would be more regular and that no one would need to steal a car. But I want to turn back to General Coggin and to really ask. I mean, General, you just heard about Major Wegner's experiences, some challenging, some very positive, and I have no doubt that others under your command could tell us similar stories of their time in service. How does the Civil Affairs Specialist Program work to integrate the expertise and experiences of someone like Major Wegner or other experts from civil society? What do you see as the benefit?
A great question, and thank you. What we just heard from Major Wegner is an example of what the Civil Affairs Specialist Program is all about. In the Army Reserve, we are citizen soldiers, and what we bring with our civilian professional skill sets often empowers what we do in our soldier profession in the Army Reserve. The 38G program and the skills and knowledge that the Civil Affairs Specialists bring to the table, when and where they are required, is not a commonly available capability in the regular Army on the scope and scale that's needed. But if required, the Army Reserve is prepared to provide the experts from our citizen soldier ranks. I'd like to echo something that Ambassador Curran said, and that's that we are excited about this collaborative program and opportunity, because it's very exciting for us as well as the Smithsonian Institute. And one thing that we've talked about, some similarities, but I think will be the difference this time that we'll achieve and benefit from this program. When you look at what occurred with the original Monuments Men and with George Stout, it was reactive and something that they had to come together and do after the fact. And then even when we heard Major Wegener's story about, when they got in there, they really, the mission developed and the cultural heritage mission that they did. But what we're doing now and what we can achieve by this is that we're training, we're acquiring professionals that will be able to already be available and ready to conduct this cultural heritage mission before the fact. So this is one of the great advantages and benefits from the program, and really epitomizes what we say in the Army Reserve: ready now, shaping tomorrow. Thank you again for that question.
Thank you so much, General Coggin. I want to follow up on this idea of ready now with a question to Dr. Curran. And so, Richard, I know this is going to be very hard for you, but if you had to pick one lesson that you hope the heritage and preservation officers would learn in their time in the training, what would that takeaway be?
We're not saving cultural heritage for people, we're doing it with people. It's often local folks, local experts and professionals, but also local citizens have the strongest stake, because that heritage represents kind of who they are. They're invested in it. And it may be a religious site of somebody of a different religion than somebody, but hey, it may be important for tourism in a post-conflict society. That's quite important in terms of economic recovery. Corey captured it really well when she talked about her efforts at the Baghdad Museum in 2003, because she had to work with Donnie George, she had to work with people from the museum, people from the community to make it successful. And if you're not working with people, it's really not going to be successful. And they have knowledge, they have resources, they have the networks, they know where to get those cars so you don't have to steal them. and working with people is really important. And I know when we did in Haiti, again, following on General Coggin's good point, we were inventing it by the seat of our pants. And we had to really establish all these relationships with people who didn't necessarily trust us going in and didn't know what we wanted to do. And sometimes people are very suspicious. Hi, I'm here to save your treasures. Well, you might be here to loot and take my treasures away. And so you really have to establish that kind of trust and that type of collaboration. And in Haiti, what we were fortunate in is not only did we have a monuments woman leading this, Corey, who had the credibility and the experience, but our key partner on the Haitian side, a guy named Patrick Delatour, who'd been charged by the president of Haiti for leading the recovery effort after the earthquake, he was just finishing up reading the Monuments Men. And so he was aware of the US effort during World War II. And here you had somebody from Haiti who kind of got the sense of what we wanted to do. And he too was in that collaborative mode, and that made it successful. And now we found that local collaboration absolutely essential as we do work in Iraq on archaeological sites like at Nimrud, like at the Mosul Museum and others, where that local knowledge collaboration is absolutely vital and key. And that would be my biggest takeaway from what people can learn in this program.
Thank you for that, Richard. I'm going to ask a similar question of Colonel DeJesse. And so, Colonel, I have come to know you as both a soldier in uniform and also as a very fine landscape painter with a very creative mind. The Heritage and Preservation Officer program certainly brings both together for you personally and professionally. What do you hope to convey to the participants during this training?
Well, Brian, so regardless whether you're an artist or conservator or curator, museum education, heritage manager, archaeologist, it's the idea that we want to harness the talents and the creativity of the people participating in this. And to the participants, I'd say is, dream big, and we're relying on you. To those that have raised their hand and volunteered, it is a volunteer army. And to those that have stepped forward to jump in this endeavor, my hat's off to them, because it is an important mission, and their expertise cannot be developed in a 2-month training program. They've worked their careers, and they're willing to work for their nation in this effort. That's how important it is, and I'm inspired by their efforts. Every day I deal with 38 Gulf, 6 victors is a great day. Great people and positive. And so the idea, Corey mentioned all the things that are going to be covered, and the idea we're going to talk about the traditional things about museum practices and protecting cultural property, but in terms of U.S. doctrine and military doctrine and joint planning process and Army planning processes and the whole of government approach. So it's the idea of expanding what they do and think in those terms. That the idea is they're going to offer something and that they're going to receive something, because what the Smithsonian and UC-K-POC have done, they've formed a training team that is equal to their expertise. We're bringing the A game to them, and they're going to be dealing with some important issues, and it'll be very challenging for them. And in that spirit, and Dr. Curran, what you mentioned about collaborations is so important. We are focusing on that aspect in this training with museum professionals that are all over the world. So we are leaning in on that one. And I just want to say, thank you to the participants for volunteering. Also, thank you, to you, Brian and Corey and the Smithsonian team, Dr. Curran and General Coggin, for your leadership to making this happen. And I said to Corey, a private conversation we had back in the fall, that why this is happening now, because the leadership said yes. And then we turned to the talented people that are in our career fields, and they have stepped forward. So we're very, very lucky. And also thank you to the donors and all the international agency partners that will participate in the host institutions that are going to jump into this with us. So it is very much a collaboration, and I'm grateful to all of them, and to the participants. Get ready to work. Thank you. It's just beginning.
Thank you, Colonel. I'm going to give Major Regner here the last word. Just recalling the moment when she retired from the United States Army to found the United States Committee of the Blue Shield. Major Regner, your efforts were so instrumental in seeing the 1954 Hague Convention ratified in the United States in 2009. What is it like for you now to see this training program realized?
Well, it's pretty exciting for me. I'll say we started working on the Blue Shield idea pretty much as soon as I got home from Iraq in 2004, and found like-minded colleagues who'd already been working on these issues for a long time. It's the culmination of a lot of work. And I'll be honest in saying that when I was in Iraq, I realized that I did not know as much about the Hague Convention as I should have going in. And in creating the Blue Shield, our goal was to try to work toward US ratification of the treaty, but also to help raise awareness of its contents with deploying military, and particularly with deploying civil affairs units. And I want to thank General David Blackledge, a former UC-K-POC commander, for really spurring on those efforts after the 352nd got back from Iraq and giving the go-ahead, and I'm grateful to General Coggin for doing the same thing at UC-K-POC now. Article 7, the military requirements of the Hague Convention, are based on the successful work of the World War II monuments men and women, and Those requirements are that we disseminate about the importance of cultural heritage within the military, and then also to create this specialist group of military personnel. And so this training will enable those goals. Personally, the last 17 years have been spent ensuring that future CA officers who are in the position I was 17 years ago are better prepared to meet those challenges and to help their international colleagues facing the loss of their heritage and their identity in a changing world. It's also been aimed at strengthening our capabilities related to cultural heritage protection in armed conflict and improving cooperation and ties between colleagues and the military. I think we have a great program and a lot more work to do, but I'm really optimistic about the future and looking forward to working with our participants and all of you. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing your passion about this training program and the desire to see it come to fruition. I want to now turn to the participants in the training program, the new Heritage and Preservation Officers. In a moment, you will meet some of the new cohort and hear about the journey of a few of these exceptional recruits. Among them are a data scientist who wants to bring her technical skills to the program, a National Guard member pursuing a PhD in art history, a former Army surgical technologist now studying archaeology who rejoined the reserves to serve as a Heritage and Preservation Officer, and a current civil affairs subject matter expert who spent years as a working archaeologist before rejoining the force. Let's learn more about the Army Monuments Officer Training Program participants.
A friend of mine shared an article about the Smithsonian Institution and the Army restarting the Monuments Men program. And after reading the article, I felt like that made perfect sense to me and for me. I'm a historian. I focus on 16th century Mediterranean issues, in particular the Republic of Venice and the Ottoman Empire, especially around the 1570s. And I felt like this was a great opportunity to want to apply my historical research methodology skill set, learn about archaeological research methodologies and preservation efforts, but also identify ways to bring digital humanities, another passion of mine, into the fold.
I applied to this unit because it's a great opportunity for me to merge my two careers and passions. I've been in the Army for the past 10 years, and I'm currently a doctoral student in art history.
I think I've always been familiar, at least with the stories of the monuments men and women from World War II. I think media has definitely helped with that. But for myself, I remember serving in a combat support hospital for a number of years before I got out of the service. And I remember telling family and friends that if I ever were to go back into the service, it wouldn't be for medicine, it'd be for cultural property.
I come from a family with a rich military tradition. My cousins, aunts, uncles, my father, my grandfather, all served in the U.S. military. Me joining up was a bit of a foregone conclusion. The decade prior to that, I was pursuing my passion for archaeology, my civilian education, my civilian experience. When I finally did join, I was sitting in the waiting room of the recruiter, and they had a bunch of promotional materials on the desk. On the cover of one of those was a picture of U.S. soldiers downrange. All around them, there were cultural heritage material, pottery at their feet, an ancient wall behind them, tremendous antiquity. And I thought to myself, my God, we need something like this.
When we protect cultural heritage, we're also protecting a community's sense of belonging and identity. And that deserves our attention, especially for those who study past civilizations, who consider themselves seekers of truth, but more importantly, preservers of truth.
It's important to protect cultural heritage during armed conflict, not only because we're legally obligated to, but because we know the long-term effects of cultural genocide. And that can be the loss of life, the loss of languages, cultural practices, and sometimes physical objects.
If we look at it through the context of preserving stories that inspire the future, I think it's kind of a very basic humanitarian obligation, humanist obligation, to preserve and protect these stories, at least for not even the sake of preservation per se, but for the sake of what we're developing as people and evolving as people groups.
Cultural heritage represents identity, the identity of a people. It also represents our shared human identity, our story on this planet. Conflict is temporary. Our story is enduring.
You know, we have an opportunity here, huge shoes to fill when it comes to living up to the standards of the World War II monuments men. And now this is an opportunity to build on that. What exactly does 2.0 look like? How exactly do we surpass the standards that they've laid before us? And what better place to try innovation and technology than the United States Army?
6 Victors really expand the capabilities of the military. The U.S. military is located around the world. We work with various populations. And strategically speaking, the protection of cultural heritage can directly impact our mission.
You need to be able to have a person who knows warfare, who knows the distinction between civilian and military expertise, and then blending those two together. I think it's a really wonderful way for the military, the Army, to contribute to worldwide cultural property protection.
The protection of cultural heritage isn't just a legal mandate. It's consistent with our Army values, and it's consistent with our national values. It's consistent with the values expressed by our culture on our own land, with our own heritage.
In the time we have remaining, we are going to open the conversation to questions from our audience. Now, there are several hundred of you, and we are not going to be able to address every question, but I will try and raise some of the key issues as I've seen them going past the question and answer chat. So I would like to direct the first question to Colonel DeJesse, and this is a very fundamental question. Colonel, how do people join the Heritage and Preservation Officer Program?
You have to join the Army Reserve and use a KPOC. You have to be, the positions are only located inside the command, inside USAC KPOC. If you are a reservist, you just transfer in over from commands. If you are interested in the direct appointment approach to enter in the service, if you're a civilian right now, you can go to talent.army.mil. and search through there, and then you'll see there's a civil affairs area there where we're searching for talents, and you select and you can search and you can locate how to join there and do an inquiry about requirements for joining the force. So that's the best way.
All right, thank you very much, Colonel. I'm going to direct the next question that I see to Liza. And Liza, there have been a number of questions about the future of the Stout Diaries. And I wonder if you might say a little bit more about the plans for conservation, their plans for digitization, and what we see as the future of that collection.
Certainly. Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you.
Oh, okay, good. I've been very heartened by the community of art conservators across the country who have reached out to us to help us with the conservation of these 4 volumes because George Stout is such a giant in the field of art conservation. We will develop a plan with the conservator for the moving forward with preserving and the treatment for these 4 volumes, and then digitize all 4 and make the digital images available free on our website for download. But we also have at the Smithsonian a wonderful platform called the Smithsonian Transcription Center, and we will upload those images to the Transcription Center, and I can bet that the 4 diaries will be transcribed maybe in a day because there's so much excitement about reading them.
I agree with you, Liza. I see a lot of excitement in the question and answer box. I'd like to direct a question toward Dr. Curran. I see a lot of questions that revolve around institutional interest and institutional support over the long run for the Army monuments and officer training. And so what do you see as the Smithsonian's commitment here and in the field generally of cultural heritage preservation to supporting the heritage and preservation officers?
Well, I think, what we've seen in the various programs that we've done, the on-the-ground responses to particular crises, is really an outpouring of help. I mean, people realize that, what we're talking about with regard to culture, typically in any crisis and conflict, you're concerned about, the physical security and protection of people, and food and medicine and shelter and those very basics. And I think a long time people have thought about, well, culture is somewhere on the list, maybe number 11 or 14 or something like that. But I think increasingly when we look at crises and what gives people strength and what is often targeted in conflict is people's religion, their belief, their racial and ethnic identity, culture kind of is really very basic and important, and people are getting that. And so whenever we've called for volunteers, we've had an outpouring of people that want to help, just like Liza's getting from conservators about wanting to help with the diaries. When we did the project in Haiti, or we do our projects in Iraq or in Puerto Rico after the hurricane, or any place else, really an outpouring. People get this and understand this. I think with the leadership at the Smithsonian now, I was undersecretary for about a decade or so, and now the secretary of the Smithsonian is Lonnie Bunch, who was a founding director of our African American Museum. And whenever we've had the issue of a response to a crisis on the ground with regard to culture, Lonnie gets it and totally gets the idea that the Smithsonian has a role to play in our world in making our country a better place. It's not just a tourist destination for people to come to. We can actually play a transformative role in the nation and the world, and people appreciating who people are and expressing their humanity to each other. So I see this as a really long-term trajectory of the Smithsonian, a much more kind of cultural activist way of supporting culture making and doing, art making and doing, design making and doing, an understanding of history and science and culture. And I expect that the Smithsonian, again, whenever we've called upon for training, for working with our colleagues in the armed services, we do get an outpouring of support both within and without the Smithsonian. So I expect this will continue for a very, very long time because it's really needed and necessary.
All right, thank you. And so Major Wedner, I'd like to direct a question at you. And this is a question I've seen about the kinds of partnerships and collaborations that the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative has developed, both in the country to other educational components of the armed forces, but also more broadly to NATO and to the conversations going on around cultural property protection more broadly among U.S. allies.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Thanks for that question. So we have been working on that level for quite a while. Back sort of in 2011, there was the collaboration from the academic community and the Blue Shield. This was before my time at the Smithsonian, but to work to create a no strike list project where we could share information. And as Richard mentioned, we've worked with the Defense Intelligence Agency and others. And of course, that information trickles up, through the NATO allies whenever a contingency operation like a NATO alliance coalition happens. And so we've been working on those issues for a long time to share information and to improve processes and procedures amongst all of us for a long time. And we're hoping that the six victors can contribute even more to that process.
All right, thank you. I have a question here that's best directed to General Coggin. And General, I think this question speaks to the embeddedness and the importance of the new Heritage and Preservation Officer cohort. How will the 38 Gulf and 6 victors contribute to the pre-deployment training about cultural heritage for other military units, and collaborate with other military education programs?
And that's a great question, because when you talk about collaboration, the first thing we're doing is building that broad and depth on our bench by having the 6 victors there available, because there's not going to be enough to go around, but by having them present within our ranks, and when the mission calls, we'll have someone that will either be there on the ground with them or provide reach back, depending on how widespread the operational environment is. So just having this training program to have these experts within our ranks gives us an advantage going forward, and as well to our other units that'll be out there practicing civil affairs.
Thank you so much, General. I want to thank everyone too in the audience for all of the interesting questions and comments that we have received. Your participation is a reminder of the great depth of concern there is about the well-being of people and the protection of their culture. We have now come to the end of our discussion time, and it is my task to again thank USACAPOC, the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, and the Smithsonian Archives of American Art for their participation and their presentations today. We are grateful as well to New Mile Media Arts for the film clip about George Stout, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Bank of America for their financial support. I also want to thank the extraordinary work behind the scenes by the Smithsonian Audiovisual Team, the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative's Communications Team, and USACAPOC's Communications Team for making this discussion happen. For those of you who want to learn more, a recording of today's conversation will be posted on the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative's YouTube channel. You can also follow the new Heritage and Preservation Officer's progress on Facebook and Twitter at Smithsonian CRI. Finally, as we come to a close, please join me in wishing the Heritage and Preservation Officers every success in the Army Monuments Officer training, and in expressing appreciation for their future efforts too. As General Dwight David Eisenhower said in 1946, pass on to the coming centuries the treasures of past ages. Thank you.